Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into a big pile of your sources, memos, articles, policy briefs, to pull out what you really need to know about the year 2025.
Specifically, that huge trade disruption, the year-long tariff showdown between the U.S. and Canada.
Exactly. And look, when people write the history of 2025, they're not going to talk about minor cultural stuff. They're going to remember the year of the tariff.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just some, bureaucratic squabble. It was an economic earthquake.
It really was. I mean, our sources are pointing to something like $90 billion in new Canadian federal spending, all of it aimed at countering these aggressive moves.
And trade flows were just violently redirected, almost month to month.
It even transformed the entire federal election in Canada. It was just chaotic. So our mission for you today is to give you a detailed roadmap of that timeline.
And I think it's vital we start with a baseline context. Because for most people, for most products, the USMCA agreement means trade is smooth, right? It keeps the vast majority of goods tariff-free. It's supposed to be the stabilizing foundation.
Supposed to be.
Right, but that foundation is just riddled with uncertainty. The USMCA is up for its big review next year, in 2026. That alone creates pressure.
And then you layer on top that President Trump is in office until 2029.
Exactly. And one of our sources uses this great phrase for it, trade war whiplash. One minute the rules are stable, the next they're just completely undermined by an executive action.
And that is the core challenge. So we're going to walk you through that 12-month timeline of 2025 step by step just to show how fast that instability can grab hold. The idea is to give you the foresight you need for what might be coming next. Okay, so let's jump right into the start of 2025. And what's really striking is the strategy here. Tariffs weren't really being used as an economic tool.
No, not primarily. They were leveraged for completely non-trade issues.
Which we see right away in January. That's the opening salvo. Trump announces a sweeping 25% tariff on all goods from Canada and Mexico.
All of them. And the justification was, well, it wasn't about trade deficits. It was framed as a national emergency response to illegal migration and the flow of fentanyl.
Instantly, you see that trade policy is now border control policy. They're one and the same.
And the market volatility just kicks in immediately. So we get to February, and everyone is just bracing for this blanket 25% tariff to hit on the 4th.
But then it doesn't.
No. Literally hours before it's set to kick in, Trump agrees to a 30-day pause. A sudden last-minute thing.
So the business community breathes this huge sigh of relief.
A huge sigh of relief, yeah. Thinking, okay, maybe it was just a negotiating tactic. But that relief lasted, what, a week?
Not even, because then he announces a totally separate measure, a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum.
And this one wasn't regional. It was aimed at all countries. So the focus just whipsaws from, regional border pressure back to this broad global metal protectionism. There was no predictable strategy.
And then we get to March, which is where it all gets incredibly messy and the real chaos begins for businesses.
So March 4th. Those original blanket tariffs, they finally hit Canadian and Mexican exports.
Okay, now just imagine you're a customs agent that day, or you're running a company trying to get a shipment across the border.
Yeah.
You get hit with this 25% charge. But then just 2 days later, Trump lifts the levies.
But not on everything. Only on USMCA-compliant products. Which sounds simple, but that 2-day window was an administrative nightmare.
Thousands of containers delayed, logistics totally disrupted, all while everyone's waiting for clarity.
And that chaos was immediately followed by real economic pain. So while the blanket tariff gets partially lifted, the specialized ones move forward. The steel and aluminum tariffs hit on March 12th.
And that hits manufacturers hard.
Very hard. But the real escalation, the thing that really hurt, came 2 weeks later. An extra 25% tariff was added just on cars made in Canada and Mexico.
That is such a rapid-fire attack on a major sector.
It is. And that kind of speed, it forces a countermove, which Canada delivered.
Right. Ottawa announces its own retaliatory tariffs on $60 billion worth of U.S. goods.
And that $60 billion figure, it wasn't random. It was like economic jujitsu. It was designed for maximum political pain.
Targeting things like bourbon and boats. Specific products.
Exactly. Targeting key congressional districts to put pressure on U.S. legislators to get involved. So by the end of March, we were in a full two-sided trade war. Billions of dollars on the line.
So moving into April, the scope just explodes. It goes global. The sources actually nicknamed this Liberation Day.
Right, because Trump enacts these so-called reciprocal tariffs on pretty much every U.S. trading partner.
The first announcement was a 10% baseline tariff on every single U.S. import starting April 5th.
Which thankfully Canada and Mexico managed to dodge. But it just showed this extreme global protectionist impulse.
It did. And then more tariffs on dozens of other countries were announced for April 9th, only to be immediately deferred for 90 days. It was this clear signal of we're willing to hit everyone, even if the rollout was a total mess.
And this is where the story shifts a bit. We go from policy volatility to legal instability, which is a huge part of the 2025 story that people often miss.
Because of the national emergency justification?
Exactly. That became the legal Achilles heel. And in May, we get this critical moment. A U.S. federal court rejects Trump's use of emergency powers for tariffs.
Wow. Okay, so that's a huge ruling. The court actually orders the White House to lift the Liberation Day tariffs and the original fentanyl-related tariffs from January.
The one that started the whole thing.
Wait, so the court basically says a huge chunk of this trade war is illegal. It sounds like the chaos should have just stopped right there.
It should have, and that's what everyone thought. But here is the critical nuance, the part that's such an important lesson for anyone in business. The chaos continued.
Ow.
Well, the Trump administration immediately contests the ruling. And a federal appeals court steps in and says, okay, while this legal challenge goes on, the tariffs can stay in place.
You're kidding.
Yeah.
So companies were forced to pay tariffs that a federal court had already said were potentially illegal.
Exactly. The tariffs are legally suspect, but the economic pain is still very, very real. It created the maximum possible instability for businesses. You just had no certainty. Are you paying taxes that you'll get back someday? Or will the administration win the appeal and make it all permanent?
The legal system gave hope, but the enforcement delay just kept the anxiety cranked to 11.
Absolutely.
So as we head into June, the pressure just ratchets up again, and this time it's focused on a specific piece of Canadian policy.
The Digital Services Tax, or DST.
Right. But first, the existing pain gets worse. The steel and aluminum tariffs are jacked up from 25% to 50%.
Which is just a brutal hit.
And then the DST thing blows up. Trump just abruptly ends all trade talks with Canada, threatens even more tariffs, specifically to kill Canada's DST.
And we should probably explain what that is. The DST was Canada's attempt to, make sure these massive U.S. tech firms operating in Canada paid their fair share of tax on the revenue they earned there.
Kind of a digital sovereignty move.
Exactly. But the U.S. saw it as discriminatory, as a hostile act targeting successful American companies.
And Trump's threat. It worked. We see this incredibly rapid Canadian retreat.
It was remarkable. Ottawa just axes the DST completely. They put out a statement saying that they'll work toward a deal by July 21st. It was a huge political loss for them, but it showed how much they wanted to de-escalate.
So a major concession, Canada gives up a key piece of its own national revenue policy to get a deal. So what happens in July?
Total disappointment. Despite Canada backing down, Trump basically just moves the goalposts.
Of course.
He decides Canada still hasn't done enough on the original issues, fentanyl and trafficking, illegal migration. So instead of a deal on July 21st, he escalates again, hikes tariffs on Canadian exports to a general rate of 35%.
So the leverage worked. They killed the DST, but the trade war just moved into a new phase.
Much more painful phase.
The pressure just gets more and more targeted as we go into August. The U.S. expands the list of tariffs again. They add 400 new categories of steel and aluminum products.
And they threw in a new 50% levy on copper, just for good measure.
Right. And at the same time, Canada tries a completely different tactic. Prime Minister Mark Carney extends an olive branch. He drops some of Canada's own retaliatory tariffs.
It was a clear, unilateral move to just try and lower the temperature, a show of good faith.
And that olive branch was, swiftly rejected in September?
Swiftly and brutally. Trump responds by boosting the levies on Canadian softwood lumber to nearly 45%.
Wow, so now they're moving past metals and going after a signature Canadian industry.
The forest sector, yeah. Hitting major employment centers. And this month was just economically devastating. Because alongside softwood, you get this whole new slate of incredibly high tariffs.
Let's just pause on these numbers for a second because they're staggering.
They are. Pharmaceuticals get hit with a 100% tariff.
100%. I mean, that's not a negotiation tactic. That's a hammer.
It's an attempt to just kill a sector. And then you have heavy trucks at 25%, kitchen cabinets at 50%, upholstered furniture at 30%. It's just brutal.
And all this is happening while the legal drama is still playing out in the background, right?
Precisely. At the same time, the federal appeals court agrees with the lower court, They rule again that the emergency powers tariffs are illegal.
So that's two courts now.
Two courts. But, once again, they leave the tariffs in place while the case gets kicked up to the highest level, the Supreme Court. The legal system is sending these clear signals that the policy is on shaky ground, but for businesses on the ground, there's no relief yet.
And that instability brings us to October and this bizarre moment of political theater that just shows how fragile everything was.
Really does.
Carney and Trump have a friendly meeting in the Oval Office. It looks like a potential breakthrough.
A moment of hope.
And then all that progress just screeches to a halt. Why? Because the provincial government of Ontario airs a 60-second anti-tariff TV ad that quotes Ronald Reagan.
An ad from a province, not even the federal government. And that was enough for Trump to suspend all discussions and threaten to raise tariffs by another 10%.
It just shows how personal and politically charged these negotiations had become, so easily derailed.
And as we get to the end of the year, in November, Trump seems to kind of lose focus on that latest threat, the 45% hike.
Probably because his attention shifted.
Right. It was consumed by the big case that was finally unfolding at the Supreme Court. And this is a really key detail for you to track going forward.
The core question of whether a president can just unilaterally impose these sweeping tariffs using emergency powers.
Exactly. And the early reports from the court suggest that most of the justices seemed highly skeptical of that idea, of that massive expansion of executive power. So there's this hint that a major legal smackdown might be coming, but the final ruling isn't expected until next year.
So we end the year in December on, what a quiet note, a kind of exhausted truce after a year of nonstop economic punches.
That's a good way to put it.
I mean, beyond a vague threat about high taxes on Canadian fertilizer, which would have hammered the farm sector, Trump pretty much declines to open a new front.
And you can understand why. After a full year of that kind of instability, policymakers and business leaders on both sides, they must have been just completely and utterly exhausted.
So when you pull it all together, what's the key takeaway from you from this whole 2025 timeline?
I think it really demonstrated the strategic use of volatility. That tariffs were weaponized not just as an economic tool, but as this incredibly severe leverage for non-trade issues.
Right. Whether it was migration, fentanyl, or even Canada's own domestic tax policy.
And if we zoom out, the USMCA is still there as the essential stabilizer, preventing a total collapse. But that legal challenge, where courts kept saying the tariffs were illegal, but they stayed in place anyway, that created a deep structural instability that really defined the year.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to mull over. Our sources are pretty clear that the Supreme Court was highly skeptical of the president using emergency powers this way. So, if the court rules against the administration next year, what happens then?
What happens legally and financially to all those tariffs that were imposed under those now invalid powers?
Exactly. And how drastically does a judgment like that change Canada's leverage in all the future trade negotiations to come? Something to keep a very, very close eye on.
For sure.
That's been the Deep Dive. We'll talk to you next time.